Stock. You used that word this morning, probably. You checked your portfolio, or someone mentioned the market, or you heard it on the radio. Stock. And the word passed through you like water through a crack. You didn't notice it. That's fine. Neither did I, until I found something I wasn't looking for and couldn't put down. I was researching the origins of financial terminology, mostly unremarkable work. Ledger from the Dutch leger, a book that lies flat. Interest from the Latin intrasse, to be between two parties. Bankrupt from the Italian bancarotta, a broken bench, the money changer's table smashed when he could not pay. These etymologies are satisfying in a particular way. They reveal that behind every abstraction there was once a physical object, a room, a gesture someone made with their hands. And then I found stock. I pulled the thread, and here's what I keep returning to. That thread goes back 700 years and ends, if that's the right word, in a fire that consumed the Parliament of England. Stay with me on this. The word stock comes from the Old English stock. A stick, a trunk, a post driven into the ground. Not a metaphor. Not a philosophical abstraction coined by a philosopher in a counting house. A piece of wood. Because in medieval England, the primary instrument of public finance, the device by which the crown recorded debts, collected taxes, issued credit, and acknowledged loans, was a split hazel rod. The system worked like this. When the exchequer received a payment or acknowledged a debt, a clerk would take a piece of seasoned hazelwood, typically 12 to 14 inches long, and cut notches into it according to a precise denominational code. The Dialogues de Scaccario, a 12th century administrative manual compiled by Richard Fitzneal, treasurer to Henry II, specifies these denominations with the kind of unambiguous clarity you would want in a legal instrument. A notch the breadth of a man's palm meant 1,000 pounds. The width of a thumb meant 100. A little finger's width meant 20. A single barleycorn's width meant 1 penny. These were not estimates. They were standards, reproduced consistently across centuries of exchequer practice. Once the notches were cut, the rod was split lengthwise down the grain of the wood. Both pieces bore the same notches because they had been cut together. The larger piece, the one held by the creditor, the person who had paid or lent, was called the stock. The smaller piece held by the crown was the foil, from which we eventually get the word counterfoil, still printed in the corner of every ticket and receipt you have ever torn away from a stub. If you have ever heard someone described as taking the long side of a trade or the short side, those terms are not poetic finance speak coined in the 20th century. They describe the physical lengths of the two halves of a split stick. The long piece, the short piece. Going long, going short. These words are fossils. They carry the shape of a technology that no one alive has used. And this is the part I want to linger on, because it is where the strangeness begins. The system was extraordinarily difficult to counterfeit. The grain of wood is unrepeatable. Two pieces of hazel split from the same rod fit together in only one way. Only along that split, only at that angle, only with those particular variations in the fiber. You could not fabricate a matching foil after the fact. You could not alter one half without the mismatch becoming immediately visible. In a world without standardized paper, without regulated printing, without a trusted banking infrastructure, this was not a primitive workaround. It was a solution. I know this sounds like I'm constructing a pattern. Maybe I am, but look at what the tally stick system actually did, and for how long it did it. From at least the reign of Henry III, around 1100, through to the reign of George IV, the Exchequer issued tallies as instruments of royal credit. That is over 7 centuries of continuous use. During the 100 Years' War, tallies financed English armies in France. During the Black Death, they recorded the fiscal collapse of entire counties. During the English Civil War, they were still circulating. They were not a medieval curiosity superseded by better instruments. They coexisted with bills of exchange, with goldsmiths' notes, with the earliest stirrings of what would become modern banking. They ran in parallel because they were trusted, because they were difficult to forge, and because, this is the detail that stops me every time, they were what the system knew. But the tally system was not without catastrophic failure. I want to be precise about this, because the temptation in a story like this is to romanticize what was lost. In 1672, Charles II issued what became known as the Stop of the Exchequer, a unilateral royal suspension of repayment on outstanding tallies and other short-term royal debt. The damage was specific and severe. The best surviving estimates, drawn from Exchequer records and the records of the affected goldsmith bankers, suggest approximately £1.3 million in obligations were frozen. 5 major goldsmith banking houses were destroyed or permanently crippled. An estimated 10,000 families were affected. Investors, tradesmen, widows holding tallies as savings, minor gentry who had lent to the crown in good faith. This was a sovereign default, carried in Hazelwood. The instrument did not cause the default, but it transmitted it with perfect efficiency. The system worked. The crown failed. And yet, it continued. Because what do you replace it with? The answer, eventually, was the Bank of England. Founded in 1694, the bank was created to provide the English state with a more reliable source of public credit. And here is the sentence that I have read 4 times because I still find it slightly difficult to believe. The Bank of England raised its initial capital of £1.2 million partly through tally sticks. The institution created to replace the old system was funded by the old system. When Parliament amended the Bank of England Act in 1697, tally sticks were still listed among the acceptable instruments of royal credit. The new and the old ran alongside each other for decades, the way technologies always overlap, each generation using both until one quietly stops being necessary. What changed was an Act of Parliament in 1782. The Exchequer was formally reformed. Tally sticks were abolished as instruments of public finance. But, and this is the detail I checked 3 times because it seemed too strange to be administrative reality, the abolition included a sunset clause. It would not fully take effect until the last Exchequer Chamberlain appointed under the old system died in office. That official died in 1826. 44 years elapsed between the parliamentary decision to end the tally system and its actual legal termination. During those 4 decades, the tallies accumulated in storage beneath the Palace of Westminster, in cellars, in undercrofts, in the space between the medieval structure and the later additions. No one had been given orders to destroy them. No one had been given orders to preserve them. They simply piled up, the way things do when institutions change direction without clearing out the rooms. The archaeology of forgetting does not happen in explosions. It happens in the 44 years between a decision and its execution. It happens in the retirement of clerks who were never replaced, in the reassignment of storage space, in the gradual reclassification of a live instrument as a historical artifact, as an administrative inconvenience. By the time anyone thought seriously about what to do with the accumulated tallies, there were reportedly centuries worth of them. Hazel rods that had once been instruments of royal credit, sitting in the dark beneath the most important legislative building in England. In 1834, someone decided they needed to go. The task was assigned to 2 men, Joshua Cross and Patrick Furlong, furnace men employed in the maintenance of the palace, working under the supervision of a clerk named Richard Whalley. On October 16th, they began feeding the tallies into the furnaces beneath the House of Lords. The furnaces were not designed for this volume of dry, seasoned wood. The copper lining of the central flue overheated. The housekeeper of the House of Lords noticed that the floors of the chamber above were warm to the touch. A detail that survives because she reported it, because she knew something was wrong, because the physical sensation of heat through stone was legible to her even when the administrative process generating that heat was not visible to anyone. At approximately 6:30 in the evening, the flue failed. The fire spread into the wall fabric of the palace and rapidly became uncontrollable. By the following morning, Both the House of Lords and the House of Commons had burned to the ground. The blaze was visible from Windsor Castle, 17 miles away. The building was uninsured. No one was prosecuted. Cross and Furlong had followed their orders. They had been told to burn the tallies, and they burned the tallies. The failure was not personal. It was institutional, which is a different kind of failure. One distributed across decades of bureaucratic inattention, across the sunset clause, across the decision not to find a better method of disposal, across every official who looked at the storage problem and decided it was someone else's concern. I know this sounds like I'm building toward an accusation. I am not. I am building toward something quieter and in some ways more unsettling. In 1850, Alfred Smee, resident surgeon at the Bank of England, Fellow of the Royal Society, a man of substantial scientific reputation, was asked to examine a collection of tally sticks that had survived in the bank's own vaults. These were objects the bank had held since its founding, instruments of the very credit that had capitalized its creation. Smee examined them carefully. He produced a report, and in that report he noted, in language that reads now like a verdict, no gentleman in the Bank of England recollects the mode of reading them. 16 years after the fire. The knowledge had not been destroyed in the furnaces on October 16th. It had been dissolving for decades before that. As the clerks who understood the notch system retired and were not replaced, as the tallies moved from active instruments to stored records to archived curiosities, to objects that no one alive had ever used in practice. The furnace was the final administrative act in a forgetting that was already almost complete. Charles Dickens, in a speech to the Administrative Reform Association in 1855, invoked the tally burning as a symbol of governmental absurdity. The state incinerating its own past through accumulated procedural incompetence, the red tape literally catching fire. He meant it as dark comedy. I keep reading it as something more precise than that, a description of how institutional knowledge dies, not in a single catastrophe, in the slow, bureaucratic accumulation of decisions that are each individually defensible, until suddenly no one can read the objects in the vault. Maybe I am seeing patterns where none exist. I want to acknowledge the simplest explanation, because it may be correct. A system that had been functionally obsolete for generations was carelessly disposed of by workers following reasonable instructions, in furnaces that turned out to be inadequate, on an autumn evening in London. Some historians who have studied this period argue that the tally system was already marginal well before the abolition. Increasingly sidelined by paper instruments and double-entry bookkeeping, its continued existence more symbolic than practical. The fire did not destroy a living technology. It destroyed the archived remnants of one. The tragedy on this reading is not a great loss. It is a small administrative failure that happened, by bad luck, to involve inadequate ventilation and dry medieval timber. Except I cannot stop thinking about 726 years. I cannot stop thinking about the 16 years between abolition and total institutional amnesia. I cannot stop thinking about Alfred Smee standing in a vault, holding objects that the institution had kept since its founding, and finding that no one in the building could tell him what they said. The language did not burn. That is the thing I keep returning to at the end of all this. The documents burned, the tallies burned, the building burned. The clerks who could read the notches retired and died. But the words survived, because words are harder to destroy than objects. Stock is still in your portfolio tracker. Foil is still in the corner of your concert ticket. Long and short are still in every financial conversation you have ever had, every article you have ever skimmed about markets. The ghost of a system preserved in vocabulary, outlasting the instruments, outlasting the people who used them, outlasting the building that stored the evidence, outlasting the memory of how to read it. Language is a kind of archive. The difference between language and every other archive is that it does not require maintenance. It propagates itself, carried forward in mouths and keyboards and screens, generation after generation, without anyone understanding what they are preserving. Most of what it preserves, no one is reading. Stock, You used that word this morning. Now you know what it used to weigh.